Hello and welcome to the video on Strategic Objective 3, Indicator 3 or SO33, Trends in the Degree of Drought Vulnerability. By the end of this video, you will know more about the UNCCD approach to assess drought vulnerability by using the Drought Vulnerability Index or DVI, the tiered approach to estimate the DVI and its components, how to select the most appropriate data for the DVI components and factors, how to normalize the DVI factors, and how to derive the DVI components and calculate the DVI. Indicators SO31 and SO32 describe the occurrence of drought hazard over time and the exposure of the population to the drought hazard. However, even if an area is experiencing drought and the population is exposed, they may not be vulnerable to its impact. Thus, indicator SO33 addresses the issue of drought vulnerability. When considered jointly, hazard, exposure, and vulnerability enable the assessment of drought risk, which describes how likely an area is to be negatively impacted by drought. The UNCCD approach to assess drought vulnerability is based on a composite index. The Drought Vulnerability Index, DVI, which incorporates three components: social, economic, and infrastructural. The DVI does not at present address ecological or ecosystem vulnerability. Parties may adopt one of the three tiers of vulnerability assessment, presenting increasing levels of computational complexity, but also increased sensitivity. Tier 1 Vulnerability Assessment or VA uses at least one factor per vulnerability component at national level. Tier 2 VA uses more than one factor per vulnerability component at national level, with the inclusion of sex disaggregated data where applicable. Tier 3 VA uses more than one factor per vulnerability component at subnational level, with the inclusion of sex disaggregated data where applicable. Let's look at the factors recommended to calculate each component of the DVI. Here are the social, economic, and infrastructural components and associated factors recommended for calculating the DVI. The three core vulnerability factors recommended for a minimum Tier 1 vulnerability assessment are literacy rate, percentage of people aged 15 and above, proportion of population below the international poverty line, proportion of population using safely managed drinking water services. The reporting process for indicator SO33 includes 7 steps. If the default data is used, steps 2 to 4 are unnecessary. Let's begin with the first step in the reporting process, which is selecting the tier of vulnerability assessment based on data availability. The Praise4 platform is pre-filled with default data derived from the global DVI dataset of the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission or JRC. The default data provides a static assessment of vulnerability for the period 2000 to 2018. But it does not assess the change in the degree of drought vulnerability over time. Therefore, parties should strive to calculate indicator SO33 using one of the three tiers of vulnerability assessment. This decision tree, found in the Good Practice Guidance for National Reporting on Strategic Objective 3, guides parties in the selection of the most appropriate tier of vulnerability assessment based on the available factors, the spatial scale of the factors, and on the availability of sex disaggregated data. Table 14 of the Good Practice Guidance for National Reporting on Strategic Objective 3 sets out the recommended sources of data for Tier 1 vulnerability assessments. If data at national level exists, parties are encouraged to move up the tiers of vulnerability assessment in order to increase the sensitivity of the DVI and improve the granularity of the assessment. The second step in the reporting process is factor normalization. In all tiers of vulnerability assessment, factors should be normalized before they can be compared and aggregated, as they are measured in different units. The factors have different relationships with vulnerability. Some have a positive correlation, as vulnerability is expected to increase with increases in the factor value. Others have a negative correlation. So, different equations are used to normalize the factors depending on their relationship with vulnerability. The adopted normalization method uses the maximum and minimum factor values within the country based on historic data up to and including the reporting period. After normalization, all factors have a value between 0 and 1 relative to the historical maximum and minimum at country level. For the default DVI, each factor was normalized using the global maximum and minimum values, rather than historical ranges for the given country. Therefore, default DVI values are not comparable to those calculated nationally. The third step in the reporting process is deriving the DVI components. When more than one factor per component is used, the arithmetic mean of the normalized factors should be calculated to derive the aggregated value of each component. If sex disaggregated data is used, separate values for male and female should be calculated for each component. Parties may assign weights to the vulnerability factors if their relative importance and relevance is known. The fourth step in the reporting process is calculating the DVI. The DVI is calculated as the mean value of the three components per subnational unit or nationally, depending on the tier level adopted. The DVI ranges from 0 to 1, with 1 being the most vulnerable. A Tier 1 VA would result in 1 DVI estimate at country level per year. For Tier 2 and 3 VAs, where sex disaggregated factors are used, sex-specific DVIs should also be calculated. With subnational data for components under Tier 3 VA, the DVI should be calculated for the smallest spatial unit separately for males, females, and the total population. DVI-related data is reported in the PRAISE4 platform in Table SO33.T1. The default value for 2018 is pre-filled in Table SO33.T1 of PRAISE4. Parties should remove the default 2018 value if they report nationally calculated DVI data for other years, as they will be incomparable. Parties should indicate the adopted tier of vulnerability assessment, which factors for each component were used in the calculation of the DVI. And for a Tier 3 vulnerability assessment, specify for which factors data was available at subnational level. The fifth step in the reporting process is verifying the results. Reported estimates should always be verified by national experts before submission, especially when using default data. Parties should highlight situations where the confidence level of the reported data might be low. The sixth step in the reporting process is performing a qualitative assessment. Parties should provide an interpretation of the indicator changes. If the DVI was calculated using national data, parties should select the dominant change observed in the DVI and provide a qualitative assessment of that change. If parties report using the default data, the ability to select the dominant change will not be available as only a single value is being reported. Parties may provide any comment on this default value as appropriate. The seventh step in the reporting process is generating reports. Parties should save the form and, once the default or national data has been verified and approved by experts, parties may submit the estimates as a revision. It is advisable to submit a revision when the other indicators under SO3 have also been completely reported and approved. Parties should provide narratives on the methodology, data sources, and data accuracy. We have reached the end of this video on SO33, Trends in the Degree of Drought Vulnerability. In this video, you learnt about the UNCCD approach to assess drought vulnerability by using the Drought Vulnerability Index, or DVI, the tiered approach to estimate the DVI and its components, and how to select the most appropriate data for the DVI components and factors. You also learnt how to normalize the DVI factors, derive the DVI components, and calculate the DVI. Thanks for your time.